So welcome to the Future of Wellbeing podcast with me, Rob Stevenson, and I'm here with Paul Duggan, who is the Global Health and Wellbeing Lead for Europe at Accenture. Welcome, Paul. I'm delighted to have you here.
Thank you, Rob. Good morning. Yes, that's my very long job title, which makes me laugh a bit. But yeah, no, thank you. Really a pleasure to be here. Looking forward to talking to you this morning.
Yeah, thank you, my friend. Well, I'm already tripping over my words, and as we were talking just before we went live, I've got a bit of a gravelly voice today because we had an evening of celebration of mental health at the InsideOut Awards, which is the big awards event that I run, as you know. And I guess, one of the things that came up for me was the importance of recognition, for people that are trying to make a difference on mental health and well-being. Yeah, particularly when I guess a number of those people have kind of doing the job and doing the mission side of their desk.
Yep.
Would you agree? How important do you think it is to kind of recognize, the efforts we're putting in to make change in mental health and well-being?
I think it's fundamental. I mean, I think probably taking a step back further, I think just recognition, full stop, is fundamental.
Sure.
There's some great studies out there about how like small, regular acknowledgements of people's efforts, even if it's just a thank you, which obviously literally costs nothing, make a huge difference to sort of people's well-being. And then I think in the well-being space, especially where you've got people, as you say, doing, well-being as plus ones and often doing it because they're passionate about it, I think an organizations really benefit from that. And I would include, my organization in that. You've got to watch out for things like compassion fatigue, like people burning themselves out because they really care about something. I think that recognition is one of the good counterbalances to that, because you're taking the time out to make sure people understand those efforts are appreciated. Make sure those people understand that contribution is valued, and also to spotlight to other people what those people are doing, because it's quite easy for people to sort of toil in the background doing great stuff, and people may receive the benefits of that but not realize that that's not just happening by magic. It's actually being driven by some very dedicated individuals. So I think giving that recognition directly also helps those people to receive that recognition more widely as well. So yeah, fundamental, I think.
Yeah, I really like what you say there. I think that there's something beautiful, isn't there, about the wellbeing industry as a whole, that people are happy to share and share the good practice. I think it's not seen as something that we want to try and get a competitive advantage over necessarily. It's something that we want to try to, help SMEs, help others to understand what good financial wellness might be, or a good menopause program might be, right?
Absolutely. And it's kind of, I think it's quite unique. So I've been to conversations at other consultancies offices where we've openly talked about what we're doing with organizations that in a day-to-day life are our competitors.
Yeah.
But it's in everyone's interests to drive this agenda forward. It's in everyone. Also, whenever you go to the conferences, one of the big things you take away is that most people are struggling with the same things.
Yeah.
And trying to solve them collectively is going to advance, both from an individual perspective and an organizational perspective, the things we're trying to achieve much more quickly than if we all get very protective about it. And, there are probably exceptions where people have got IP, or people, and we know there are people in this industry who are maybe in it for more,
Yep.
Still understandable, but sort of financial reasons. But generally, it's not something we're going to solve on our own. And that collaboration, I think, is really powerful and quite inspirational. And it's a great way to meet some really cool people as well. Very simply put.
Yeah, and again, we felt that last night of bringing 300 of those people together at a celebration at the awards to, just enjoy the company of people that you've built up that relationship based on a common sense of passion and purpose, right? And I think that's the other common theme, isn't it? That that meaningful activity and sense of purpose in what we do in well-being. It's pretty strong.
It is, and I think we were reflecting on this internally in my team the other day, actually, that one thing we almost need to be careful about when we're looking at solutions for a big company is we're very privileged that we, on a day-to-day basis, get to work in something where the purpose is very explicit and very clear. And there's that great story about the guy at NASA who cleaned the corridors or did the vending machines, and when he was asked what he did, said, "I'm here to put a man on the moon." And that's always used as that articulation of purpose. But creating that every day for everyone can be a challenge. Whereas I think working in this space, you get that sort of boost almost on a daily basis, even without realizing it.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? And immediately I knew this would happen with you and I, mate. We'd go right off topic, off script. But
Yep.
the idea, we talk a lot about purpose and aligning people to company purpose, and I think a lot of companies and corporates have invested in that. But at an individual level, in terms of your job role, that might not be possible to feel a sense of purpose in what you do. And I think I often talk about sometimes people will need to find meaningful activity in their lives that is not in the workplace to have that full experience of being a human. And I think it's important, therefore, to create space and permission for hobbies and time and things like that, isn't it?
Absolutely. Well, one of the things that and we might get to sort of my sort of story in a minute, but when I started, I certainly went through a period of reflection and readjustment in my life. And I run a lot of our mental health ally training. One of the things I talk a lot about is having what I call a broad definition of success. So, and certainly I was someone I think who suffered from having quite a narrow definition of success at some point, which was very much on, was I doing well at work?
Yeah.
And my definition of doing well at work was very much based on progression.
Yeah.
And there is a reality as you get older for most people that kind of progression wave will slow down and it will get bumpier. And if that's the only way you really sort of define your success, then that's going to become a struggle. Whereas if you look at success in a broader, and in some ways, I think this is kind of what well-being really is. If you look at success in terms of, yes, your work, I do actually think almost everyone should be able to find some kind of purpose in their work, but maybe not make that the sole source of purpose in your life. Are you doing things you care about? And I think that's where you see a lot of this +1 community in work come from as well. People finding something they can do in work they're passionate about that maybe isn't part of their core day-to-day role. But, are you spending time on hobbies and things you can enjoy? And you can obviously see the shelves behind me are fairly busy. Are you investing in the relationships in your life? And are you investing in your well-being? Are you looking after your body? Are you looking after your mind? Are you most of the time, not all the time, because pizza is great, taking the time to eat the right food and all those kind of things.
Yeah.
And that's really broadening my definition of success has really helped me in terms of self-care, because now I know that if, 2 or 3 of those things I'm not looking after, that means something's wrong and I need to stop and reflect and readjust. And it doesn't mean I'm protected from poor mental health or having trouble again. But it means I've got at least a set of warning signs so I can look after myself. And it also means I think I've got a better perspective on life, which in itself makes life more enjoyable. Versus if you're setting your sights on just a promotion or just a pay rise, and that thing doesn't happen, then that becomes a disaster. And it's not necessarily.
Yeah. And there's a few things I could respond on there. You mentioned the kind of pizza. Pizza for me squarely sits in the 80-20 rule, which I like to live life by. And, pizza forms part of my nutritional 20% for sure. And that idea of linear progression and career progression as being the measure of success, I think that is kind of how we're, I guess, certainly in our generation, taught that that's kind of what we should be doing, striving for. And I love the work of Helen Tupper and the Squiggly careers idea of, our paths aren't linear, certainly in a career perspective. And I think we've got to think about those kind of bumps and those changes. But I love this concept of broadening our definition of success. And can you expand on that? Can you expand on it? What does success mean to you?
So success to me now means doing work I care about, doing work that makes a difference to people. And I think once you've kind of tasted that, it's very hard to get. And some of that is selfish as well. It sounds very altruistic, but it gives you a good feeling. And there's lots of studies out there about how doing stuff for other people is actually very good for you, which is a nice synergy, right? It's something we shouldn't be embarrassed about, that we also get something out of it.
No, and it's not selfish, right? Because it's one of those complete win-wins.
Absolutely,
it's great for you and great for the person, organization, environment that we're helping.
Yeah, I think it's I'm a father. I've got a 2.5-year-old. It's having the time to invest in your relationships and appreciate the people in your life. I've also got, my parents are getting older, which is a morbid thing to say, but it's true.
Yeah.
Obviously we're all getting older. So having the time, it's some of it's about making sure you avoid regrets, another part of your life. And then it is very much around, for me, the stuff I now know I have to do to kind of look after myself and keep myself on a fairly even keel. And that is having time to exercise. That is having time to sort of make my own food, or at least one of us in the household has time to make the food. So we're doing sort of good, healthy food again, 80-20. And it's having time to socialize. It's like having time to see my friends, having time to do things I enjoy, like go to cinema or go to concerts or go to live comedy, which, you know, I do less than I used to before I was a parent, but still those things, if I'm doing all that, then life's pretty good. Whereas I think some of my bigger ambitions in a way have sort of faded a little bit because I've come to appreciate more. The other way I frame things now is when I get sort of well, hopefully 80, I look back at my life. Am I really going to give a hoot if I didn't get that particular accolade or that particular project or piece of work in a year, versus if I look back and, you know, I've not taken care of my body, I've not got a good relationship with, you know, members of my family. That's going to be far more material when I either cark it or get downloaded into a cyborg body, whichever is what's going to happen in 40 years time.
Well, yeah, looking at your background, and we are going to get to that, a cyborg body, probably something that might appeal to you. But a few things that kind of resonate for me, and I'm keen to understand in a little bit about everything you described there. Do you need to protect in a high performance culture like Accenture? And so before you answer that, the other reflection that, and again, quite morbid, but and this came up in the last podcast, is one of the kind of reflections of stoicism and that way of thinking was to think about the people you love and just imagine they'd got 24 hours to live. You know, and I often do that. It's a really weird thing to think about, but think about if my little lad had got 24 hours to live, would I be concerned with finishing off the latest PowerPoint? No, I would not. I would do whatever he wanted to do. Now, you can't do that all of the time, but I think framing the things that are important to us that we want to reflect back on 80, we're not going to care whether that business plan was quite as good as it could be. We are going to care about all of the things that you mentioned. So back to my question, do you have to intentionally and use intent to protect that space in a high performance culture like Accenture?
Yes, I think you do. It's one of the things we again talk about when we do mental health training. It's a two-way street with any company. So the company needs to be respectful of your well-being and your boundaries, but that only works if you will actually talk about what your boundaries are. And will be open about and understand what, even before that, understand what your boundaries are. I did not used to understand my boundaries. Or at least I used to have a very different set of boundaries that weren't very good for me. Let's put it that way. So, which goes, I think, to your point about being intentional. You want to, I think, fairly regularly take some time to think about what really matters to you, what you think is good for you, and then see how you have space in your life for that. And that absolutely should involve saying, for example, by the way, on Thursday nights, I play five-a-side football. And not being afraid to say that to your line manager, your boss, whoever it is. And you know what? There might be 1 week in 7 where you make the choice that actually I'm not going to go to five-a-side football because I'm a bit stressed about this piece of work and I want to just stay back for a couple of hours and get it done. And the right thing for you in that moment is to get it done. Or there might be a time when you make a choice that for the good of the team, that might be the right thing to do.
But use the word choice. You make the choice, and you personally make the choice rather than feeling you have to miss that five-a-side football because that's what the culture demands.
Absolutely. And one thing that drives me a bit mad is when people say, "Oh, but I haven't got any choice," and I'm like, "You've pretty much always got a choice." And that choice might even be to leave an organization because you don't like the culture of that organization. And I know that could sound a bit flippant, especially in a tougher economic environment. But that is still a choice. It might be a difficult choice, and the right choice at that time might be, no, I'm going to knuckle down and stay and put up with a culture I don't love because I'm more worried about paying the mortgage. But that still is a choice. The moment you frame it to yourself that it's not a choice, you sort of surrender your agency, and I don't think that's good for you. And I'm not saying that's easy, but I think that is a really important mindset shift, that even if you're sometimes making decisions you're uncomfortable with, you're still making those decisions, because that means at a point when circumstances change, or even you feel the pressure of that situation maybe change to the point that you can change that decision.
Yeah.
But conversely, more simply, I think most people have, a level of empathy, a level of decency, as long as you're kind of reasonable. I mean, if you go into work and say, hey guys, I like to work out at 10 o'clock every morning and then I like to go swimming at 3, that's probably not going to fly.
Mm.
Um, but saying that, these are the nights these are the times I have to do school pickup, so I won't be available. These are the sort of days where I have a hard finish because I've got this commitment. Um, I'm going to go out, being demonstrative that you go out for a walk every lunchtime, blocking that time as out of office in your diary. People will generally be respectful of those things.
Mm.
But they can't be respectful of them unless you're open about them. And I do think a lot of well-being, we've had this big mental health dialogue going on for, really a decade now, maybe a bit longer, about sort of talking about our mental health. But I think there's a broader piece, which is just openly talking about the things we do to look after ourselves
Yeah.
as a great sort of preventative in terms of helping people to bring balance into the workplace.
Yeah, 100%. This I talk about this a lot, and I frame it as well-being non-negotiables.
Yeah.
And again, I got this idea from one of the role models, one of your fellow role models on the InsideOut LeaderBoard, Abhijay Jain at PwC. And Abhijay runs a deals team, so they get pretty busy at times.
Yeah.
But what they do is they do exactly what you say, but as a team, they share their 1 or 2 things they need to do each week, the 5-a-side football match or the book club or get home to bath children or whatever it might be. And because they share it amongst the team, they then kind of hold each other to account about them, but also kind of cover each other as well. Like, you've got that football. Like, what do I need to do to help you get to your football tonight? And that kind of social contract in teams, which I think is beautiful, right?
Yeah, and I before I moved into HR, my last sort of 4 years in the more client-facing part of business was in a deal team as well.
Yeah.
And it's very precious. It's a very precious environment.
Yeah.
And I just used to say at the start of deals, I was quite blunt about it. And this was when I was coming out of kind of recovering from a difficult time of mental health.
Yeah.
I just said, I don't work evenings, don't work weekends. And if that's a problem, find someone else.
Yeah.
No one ever found anyone else. And then inevitably, I would sometimes make the decision that, going back to my point, that I would break my own rules because I felt it was the right thing to do at the time for
Yeah.
me or for the deal. And exactly what you said, people would come up to me and go, why are you here? Go home.
Yeah.
Because you'd set your boundaries. And people, and it's something I just, I'm quite blunt in my style sometimes. I wouldn't necessarily encourage people to go maybe as hard as I did or have a, do it in your own style. But telling people about your boundaries, generally, I think they will respect them, or at least do their best to respect them. But they can only do it if you open up about it. And I also don't think it's something, certainly I don't think in my organization, obviously I can't speak for everyone, to be afraid of. It's not going to limit your career.
Mm.
And the other thing about careers is careers should be a long game. I think another thing, going back to the point about success for me, is it's about sustainability of success. So you want to have a long and healthy career, not sort of, and I hate this kind of grift culture that there's this narrative about, use your 20s to kind of fry yourself because you've got the bit of energy in the bank and you do, but there's consequences to that later on. And people generally are not good at looking past the end of next week, let alone into the next decade of their lives. So it's very understandable. But if you take an extra 6 months to get a promotion, again, when you're 80, doesn't matter. But if what you've done to accelerate that promotion by 6 months leads to you then having to take sort of 10 weeks off because you burnt yourself out, that's probably going to have longer term repercussions than anything else.
Yeah, and then we're sort of then kind of, there's a couple of ways I could go from this. We're kind of leading into kind of the well-being as a component of performance.
Yeah.
And I'll come to that. You've used the word kind of afraid, don't be afraid, don't have fear a couple of times. This also speaks to me about, how do we create cultures of safety, psychological safety, the ability to speak up, the ability, feeling comfortable having those conversations or talking about your boundaries. Clearly, there's a role for the individual in having the confidence to do that. There's also a role for the line manager, the immediate manager, in creating that. And there's a role for the center in terms of how the culture is disseminated down from leadership messaging. How have you worked and how do you see an effective culture of safety generated in a large organization?
So, I mean, I think it's not an original answer, but I think storytelling shares a big part. And I think that's storytelling at all levels. So I think you have the role modeling element of very senior people talking about their mental well-being or how they look after themselves. And our current UK CEO, Simon Eaves, is very good at this actually, which is wonderful. That gives people a sense of permission. But I think also when people are willing to share their stories about when they've had a difficult time or even how they positively look after themselves from all levels, that's probably as impactful, because it's very easy. We talk a lot about leaders role modeling, and it is important, but it's very easy to look at someone very senior and go, well, that's great, but you've got a team around you. You are very much the master of your own destiny because you're in charge. But I joined last week, so how can I do it? So when you have stories from all levels, that makes a big difference. And it's also about, I think, that I don't think there's one of the things that's difficult in a big organization is how you grapple with sort of scale versus personalization. So I think it's also teaching people how to create safe spaces. And then when people do that successfully, helping them to signal boost them. So, two examples would be, we have a wonderful menopause group called the Men Are Warriors, which was very much a grassroots thing that once it got momentum and we knew about it, we were able to help. There's also a really good, very junior group in our analyst consulting group called Silly Question But, which they call SQB.
Yeah.
And it is a Teams channel that only junior people can access. And it's a safe space to ask, like, where do I get a power charger? How do I charge my time? The things that you think maybe I'd kind of stopped listening when they were telling me in my induction. So I don't think there's like one simple answer. But then I also do think, going back to line managers, it's fundamental. And I worry sometimes talking about line managers, because every presentation I go to on any topic, it's like the answer is always we need to train the line managers. And if I'd sort of noted down in any sort of conference you went to, a number of times people said you need to train the line managers, and sort of took it away and built a curriculum, then the line managers would be like in training for a month. Yes. So I think it's more about, how do you train people to be comfortable asking how people are? And then how do you, I think this is the more important bit, train them to be comfortable with the fact they might not have the answers.
Yeah.
And know where to go to get the help.
Yes.
If someone raises something they're not sure how to solve.
Yes.
Because I think it's much more that discomfort piece. And you see this a lot when one of the questions we ask when we do our mental health ally training is, why don't people ask people even if they're worried about them? And one of the big answers that comes up, it's probably not surprising in a kind of consultancy organization where everyone's very geared towards problem solving, is, I don't know what to do if they tell me something's wrong. And trying to reassure people, but that's okay. What we're asking you to do is to help uncover either a problem if someone's got one, or, going back to our earlier conversation, more ideally, the things people need to do to keep themselves well.
Yeah.
And one of the things I've started doing, making a habit of, is we have our own priority setting tool. I'm sure lots of other organizations have similar. I set myself a priority that my boss could see that says, I want to make sure I go for a lunchtime walk at least 3 times a week, because I know I drifted out of my own good habits, and it's not really her problem, but she knows about it. And this was my old boss, actually. I've just moved to a new team, and she would ask me about it when we had our review. And it's just, that external accountability is always helpful as well, I find.
Yeah.
So
I love that.
I mean, that's quite a rambling answer, but I do think it is a jigsaw. I do think the line manager is key, but we need to also make sure we're looking after those people leads as well. And actually, I think that's the final bit, is I think collectively in the sort of well-being narrative, we need to get better at looking at focusing on the well-being of the people who lead teams as a way of demonstrating and creating that culture, versus telling them how to look after the people below them, but not telling them how to look after themselves.
100%. I love that. I absolutely love that. The idea of a work priority list where well-being is front and center amongst other objectives and priorities, I think is a great idea, and I'll start talking more about that. With the line manager, you sort of sparked a thought that Tim Munden, the previous chief learning officer of Unilever, has shared with me a few times, which is his view is we need to simplify what we're asking of line managers. And really hone in on the responsibilities that we want them to focus on, rather than hitting them with absolutely everything and allowing them to do those well. With, I think you're really on point with looking after their own well-being, and being able to have that conversation is one of those priorities. But I think the scope of most line manager positions has just grown pretty significantly over the years.
I totally agree. Yeah, no, I know Tim, and I think he's spot on. I think it's the challenge is, and this is where, and we've had this conversation a bit on LinkedIn. I sometimes get a bit frustrated when people are like, "Oh, it's not benefits, it's culture," and it's like, "Oh, well done." Yes, culture is harder to change than deploying a benefit. Does that mean all benefits are bad? No.
No.
I think in a lot of organizations, the role of a line manager has become very much about the data. It's about the day-to-day output or the week-to-week output. And so you've got that shape of, my job is to get this team to deliver a month's worth of work in a month. And when you say, actually, no, part of your job now needs to be to think about the well-being of that team, where does that capacity come from? And what we need to do is look, and I think there's some really interesting things coming out of the 4-day week trials at the moment about productivity and about simplification of work. And I think, I work in a company, and this is true of consultancies, it's true of law firms, where our business model is based on fundamentally people paying fees for our people's time.
Yeah.
And that raises some difficult questions about something like the 4-day week.
Yeah.
But I think what we can look and learn from the 4-day week, even if you're not going to move to a different time pattern, is the lessons about simplification, how they've created that capacity, and use that to kind of create capacity for people like line managers, who we all keep saying are so key to the day-to-day well-being of people. So yeah, I think it is about simplification, but I don't think it's just about simplification of their role. I also think it's about simplification of work, full stop. And how do we learn some of these lessons about, meetings are a great example.
Yeah.
Shorter meetings with a clear agenda, meetings with a clear objective, getting people to stay on topic. And I say that as someone who, this is probably evident from this conversation, likes a chat.
This is a chat though, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, but it's very easy, and more easy, I think, in this kind of hybrid world, to fill time. So I think, yes, we need to simplify it, but we also need to be really intentional about where we're creating that capacity and what people use it for, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and you're right. And I think we can create capacity, and we've got the whole kind of generative AI and how that might help simplify roles. And I think it's what we choose to do with that capacity as an organization that's important, because we can choose to make more profit, or try to make more profit, or we can choose an objective of the health of the humans that are making that profit. My hope, and I'm sure yours is as well, is that we use some of this extra capacity to look at that human sustainability and longevity for humans, right?
Well, I wouldn't actually make that distinction. I think we should be choosing it to make more profit. The way we should be choosing it to make more profit is by focusing on the well-being of people, because I think one of the big challenges with well-being is, I think most people understand and acknowledge the business case for well-being.
Yeah.
And going back to your point about win-win, theoretically, with well-being, there is a win-win case for businesses and for individuals. That all the evidence shows that if you look after your people, they'll be more productive, they'll be more loyal, they'll take less time off. I'm from an absence perspective, I mean, not from a holiday perspective. Take your holidays. But the problem is, it's a long-term business case. And going back to the point about shifting culture, you can't shift culture in a quarter.
No.
So, but I do think, yes, we should be using those things to create capacity, and we should be using that capacity to focus on longer term business objectives versus the kind of in year ones, because that's where well-being sits. It's a long-term game, and the companies that I think do that well are the ones that already, we've already seen the great work that Indeed have done around sort of the correlation stock market performance, for example. But I think that's how companies can make that space to realize those longer term ambitions.
Yeah, 100%. So we're sort of segueing nicely into future of wellbeing and where things are heading. Before we do that, I want to talk about you, and I do want to know for our listeners and our watchers. So if you could describe your background to me. I'm seeing a lot of colour in a kind of cubes of a library. What's in there? What's that all about, Paul?
Well, obviously it's the classic IKEA shelving that almost all of Britain have in their homes. Other shelving brands are available.
Indeed.
It is 90% Transformers. And I have been mostly obsessed with Transformers since 1984. Um, and I
How
think
old were you in 1984, if I can
I was
ask?
born in 78, so I'll be like 5, 6. Um,
Brilliant.
I remember a difficult time in my childhood when I asked for a Transformer and my mother bought a GoBot, but we got
Wow.
through it. Um, and there's something about the combination of, I was actually listening to a podcast about this morning on my morning walk. I think the combination of the fiction, um, and then just the fact that these things are so tactile,
Hmm.
the fact that you do something with them, and I think this very much appeals to just the way I'm wired. Um, and then also more broadly, I just like sort of superheroes, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
One of the things that came out of one of my times in therapy when I was doing CBT was that I have an overdeveloped sense of justice, which sounds really cool,
Hmm.
but actually just means that if you push it in front of me in a queue, I'll be annoyed about it for like the next 4 hours.
Okay.
But it does also mean that kind of, that slightly trite good versus evil stuff really appeals to me. So
Brilliant.
Optimus Prime running around being I think a good male role model actually,
Yeah.
whilst also, occasionally shooting people, which is obviously less good. Yeah, not movie Optimus Prime. The Michael Bay Optimus Prime is a bad role model, but the
Yeah.
original sort of cartoon
Yeah.
comic one. So
I'm with you.
yeah, and then I think as I've got older, there was a point when I probably put this stuff on the shelf a bit, and went to uni, or even when I went to uni, I took a couple and put them on the shelves. Having a bit of disposable income, there's a really nice community around it for the most part. And
Hmm.
going back to that point almost of finding safe spaces for people. There is a really nice community. People help each other out. It's somewhere where, interestingly, I've seen men be able to be much more open because they've had these shared experiences. And actually, there's a forum I'm part of now where one of the really nice things is it started quite recently, and then they just realized everyone was the same demographic and everyone was talking about kids, and they just created a separate section where people could sort of talk about their trials and tribulations. And
Brilliant.
that's one of the
Brilliant.
most engaging bits of it. So it's a real soup, but
Man,
yeah.
man. So this is blowing my mind, right? And for a number of reasons, Paul. One, the fact that you've retained a passion from your childhood, from your early childhood through to now, is incredible, and it's wonderful because there's again loads of research on the importance of play and creativity and um, often we lose that as adults and then we sort of try and rediscover it, but you've retained that, which is beautiful. And then that has led you to a supportive male community around this shared passion. I mean, human connection, support, peer support, there's just so much good stuff in there. It's brilliant. And we could talk for hours on this, and I know you could, and I'm not going to let
Yeah, very,
you. Yeah.
very
So,
wise.
so you're expecting this question at some point. It's come a bit later than I'd normally ask it, but how are you today? I'm a 9 out of 10, exceptional form, and I don't hit a 9 very often because of the wonderful experience of the Inside Out Awards. I put a lot into it, and it was a really good fun event. I didn't sleep enough, so that would normally take my form down, but I have scheduled a nap this afternoon, which is one of my complete guilty well-being pleasures in
Oh,
this world.
why not?
um so what's your score today?
Well, firstly, I was very pleased to come on and see you at a 9 out of 10. I think I'm an 8 out of 10.
Great.
And I think when I woke up, I was probably more like a 7. I went to bed a bit late last night because I went to the cinema. Um, well, although the movie was awesome, so go and watch. Well, I don't know when this will come out, but go and watch Spider-Verse. It's amazing. Um, but then my daughter was just hilarious this morning. She was just really on really good form. And then it doesn't happen very often, but on some mornings, usually I do drop off because my wife's a teacher and has to start fairly early. But this morning we were both able to do drop off, and I was able to walk my wife to work. So those two things, and also this conversation that's gone on have pushed me up to an 8.
Yeah, amazing, brilliant. Again, power of connection, right? Well,
Yeah,
really good to hear. So we're very good form together. Now, you've touched on this a few times, your journey. Tell me why you're so passionate about mental health and well-being in the workplace.
sure. So I think the first sort of well, the sort of transformational moment for me, I might jump forward and backwards a bit in time here, was probably about, and I kind of lose track of this because you tell the story and then you realize that time's gone on. I think about sort of 7 years ago now, maybe 8 years ago, and I burnt out basically.
Mm-hmm.
I'd already been having a difficult year. I'd already been diagnosed with anxiety and depression. Um, I was on medication, and then just one last thing. I wasn't really enjoying work, and I wasn't really enjoying work because I was kind of chasing promotion in a very unquestioning fashion. So going back to that narrow definition of success, I was just like, that's the next milestone. But my question was always, what do I need to do to get promoted versus what do I want to do to actually have a satisfying career? And so I was doing work that I was less interested in because that was the right work to do to get promoted. And then my personal life wasn't going very well either. I was in a relationship which was kind of on its way out. And I was traveling at the time with work as well. So I was trying to manage like a failing relationship whilst being away a lot of the time.
Yeah.
And then just one last thing went wrong in my personal life. I just woke up and was like, I can't today. And I ended up taking about 10 weeks off, all fully supported by Accenture, which is, something that I think speaks volumes about how we do transport people. And in that time, obviously with help, I sort of realized two things. One, I realized I was sort of done with traveling for work, and I'd probably been on the road for the best part of sort of 14 years, and for the most part, really enjoyed it. It can be quite an intense culture because, there's a bunch of people all out of town, but it's also a lot of fun, and you get this real kind of communal mentality around it as well. But I'd kind of got to the point where I think it left me feeling a little bit marooned in life. I didn't really feel like I had much of a home or a base. But the second and more, I think, impactful thing that came out was realizing that I've probably struggled with anxiety for my entire life, which on one hand was a bit frustrating because, I'd rather have learned that at 7 than 37. But on the other hand was actually quite relieving because it enabled me to put a lot of things. It made sense of a lot of things.
Yeah.
I had periods of depression before. I had struggled a lot with what I just thought was stress as a teenager around things like exams, to the point I had counselling as a teenager as well. And it also gave me some power over it because suddenly it was a thing. And all these things I'd kind of just assumed were really part of me, like especially the avoidance. And I think talking about, being a man again, the idea that you're scared of things is not very compatible with the traditional definition of masculinity.
It's not.
So it's embarrassing, and you get down on yourself because you're like, you shouldn't. And then you actually understand what this thing is, and you understand there are things you can do about it. And that's not to say it's got away completely, and it's also not to say that I don't anticipate I think I'm still on a journey with my mental health, although I actually think that's a really healthy reflection. I think. And, I really liked your post a few weeks ago when you were having a sort of a down period, and that acknowledgement of it and almost acceptance of it, but also that underlying hint of optimism that there's a way through it because you've been there before.
Acceptance and hope. It's the two really big things, particularly with depression, but across all challenges to our mental health. Really important, I think.
Absolutely. And so I came back to work, and I had a slightly mixed experience coming back to work. So, again, going back to this experience of, potentially the line manager, some of the people I thought would really be there for me weren't. And I won't explore why I think that was, because that's, with them, I guess. But some people I really wouldn't think would be there for me were, people I'd maybe had a sort of slightly, difficult relationship on points in projects or something, were just phenomenal. And other people who I had good relationships with, but weren't necessarily my part of the business. And I was helped to find a place in Accenture where I could travel less, still be doing valuable work, and supported in that transition back in a way that allowed me to, work on that broader definition of success. But having said that, coming back, what was very apparent was there weren't a lot of men talking. Well, at that point, there probably weren't that many people talking about mental health full stop, although our mental health program was already going. But it was a bit harder to find at that point. And, the fact that I'd had this thing for my entire life, but it was only really now that I was understanding it and how. So one of my big passions is making sure we're talking about this stuff so people can not self-diagnose, because don't self-diagnose. If you think you have anxiety, don't go onto Google and Google anxiety, go and talk to a professional.
Yeah.
But if you think you have anxiety, you're probably right that something is up. go and find out what that something is. And it might be something to do with neurodiversity, it might be
Yeah.
depression, it might be
Yeah.
bipolar, it might be PT, it might be also, it might be a load of comorbid things. Or it might be actually it's none of those things, and then someone will tell you that it's not those things, and you get that reassurance. You're never
Yeah.
wasting anyone's time by reaching out and saying, I think something's up. So
Yeah.
one is creating that atmosphere where we talk about these things in a way that people can recognize things about themselves. And the other, because I did have a little bit of a bumpy ride back, is making sure we institutionalize the right behaviors about health and well-being,
Yeah.
and particularly at the time, mental health. Although having done that side of desk for a long time, so for about 3 or 4 years, what that led to, and there is an element of making your own luck, and there's also an element of genuine luck, was our UK HR lead at the time decided to create some more dedicated wellbeing roles in HR, and I applied. And based on the side of desk work that I've done, that took me into the broader wellbeing space.
Yeah.
And one of the things I have become more interested in the last 4 years is how we almost reintegrate mental health a bit with the wider narrative about wellbeing. I do worry a little that mental health has become such its own narrative that people are probably, and some of the solutions that come with that are too narrow versus, I think there's a simple reality that doing exercise, for example, for most people is one of the best things you can do around your mental health.
100%.
And that integration of, looking after, making sure you understand your financial situation and taking time to budget and understand your money is one of the best things you can do to look after your mental health. How we kind of create that navigable wellbeing journey for everyone is one of my big passions now as well.
Yeah, amazing. And look, thank you so much for sharing your challenges, and yeah, it's great to hear the support you got, and also great to hear that you've, that has led you to be, this journey to doing what you're doing today, which is wonderful to hear. So thank
And
you.
actually, if you don't mind, there's one more thing I want to add to that. The other experience I had more recently, I just want to mention this because I don't think I hear enough people talking about this, is more recently I also suffered from postpartum depression.
Yeah.
So I took, and again, very privileged. Accenture has a great shared parental policy, so I was able to take 4 months off about 6, 7 months after the birth of my daughter. I found coming back to work really difficult because my expectations of myself, based on pre-having a child versus my expectations of myself and of myself as a father, were not compatible. And it also coincided with some big periods of change at work, which is, no one's fault, not a complaint. The positive thing was, because I now sort of know when things are going off the rails, I probably had a 2-week period where I went from kind of starting to suffer to actually getting help.
Yeah.
But I just want to mention that because I think it's something we need to start normalizing more. And I still see a lot of narratives around parenting that are a little bit excluding fathers and fathers' mental health. And I think that's another big area that work has a part to play.
Yeah, I think you're right, and thank you for sharing it. I think as a father, you often feel that it's wrong for you to be feeling anything challenging because you've got to support your partner or whatever. So yeah, no, thank you for sharing. So look, clock is ticking for us. I want to talk about the future. We've touched on it a little bit, and again, you called me out on LinkedIn in a very nice way, in a correct way, where I had a big headline of wellbeing solutions are not working, which I then caveated by point solutions do work for those that use them, and there are many solutions out there that get berated, such as yoga, such as meditation, such as even free fruit, that the people that benefit from these, it can be, that could be their only free fruit in the week, in certain workplaces, right? Their only nutrition that they're getting. For some people, yoga is transformational. For some people, mindfulness is life-saving. So, I agree that they work. But you called me out because what I was trying to say was, look, we're still seeing collectively workplace burnout rise in the Gallup data. We're seeing workplace stress rise. And you've touched on this a little bit, but thank you for calling me out to make sure I don't, get too sensationalized and try and polarize too much. But there's this bit around, kind of that we need solutions, but the harder bit and the longer term bit is changing workplace culture or the impact of work on our well-being. Just expand on that a little bit for me, and your view on that.
Well, I think there's always, with most big problems, there's always like at least a two-speed solution. So you've got to deal with the consequences now.
Yeah.
And I think that's where benefits and things like EAPs, for example, have a big part to play. And, I'm a big fan of the work Deloitte do every couple of years on the sort of ROI on mental health, and EAP's 3-to-1 ROI, which is pretty good. And then you go up the scale to things like allies training 5-to-1, and then screening as the best one. And I'm really quite proud, and shout out to Sheila Piper, who is now leading wellbeing in the UK. Who's leading an amazing screening effort we're doing with our UK employees. So I think, we need to not, those things are, well, one, I think those things can be culturally significant depending on the topic. So if you look at something like, say, financial education or menopause support, and even previously when we introduced mental health supports, those are a signal that an organization is happy to talk about those things.
Yeah.
And I think that is really significant.
Yeah.
What that doesn't necessarily do is change the underlying, if you've got a culture of long hours or too many meetings or people not prioritizing, doesn't change those things. And I think that goes back to what we were talking about before, which is, I think the hard bit of culture change is creating the space for the culture change. The aspirations, I think, are there in most organizations one way or another. And then it's having the right executive sponsorship for it. And I do think I see some narratives on things like LinkedIn where there's not a switch you can flick on culture. I think it's a long-term journey. That's going to be, change is always uncomfortable. And it's usually, going back to your point about wiggly lines, it's going to be a wiggly line. So we need to make sure that what we're doing is not seeing, to your point, not polarizing. So there's things we need to do now that will mitigate some of the impacts, that will also address things that just haven't previously been addressed, like menopause again. And then we need to be sort of keep pushing on that door in terms of, how do you equip line managers to have those conversations? Yeah. How do you create the psychological safety for people to open up? And I think the big one is, how do you start to use data to better prove and align your sort of company's big objectives with the wellbeing outcomes you want to see? Because I think instinctively, those of us who work in this space believe that's there, but we need to take people on a journey. And I do think there's also another big challenge that we need to acknowledge for like leaders in companies, that we're often basically telling leaders that the way they've worked their entire careers wasn't a good way to work, and it now needs to be different. And that's I don't think it's a particularly winning sales pitch.
It's not, right.
You've got to turn it into, I mean, simply in some ways, what's in it for them, in a way that's respectful of the paths they've trodden, because the paths they've trodden are the reason people like you and I are having these conversations now. And I think that sometimes gets a bit lost in the narrative. And it's difficult, because I think there are people who probably do indulge in like wellbeing washing and so forth and so on. And obviously we're having this conversation in Pride Week, and you always get this big narrative about sort of pride washing. But inside Accenture, I see the difference Pride makes to our LGBTQI community, because there are gay people at Accenture, and it's not, so they're participating in it. And all these things have flourished under these sort of leaders that we're now sort of. So there needs to be a more. I think there needs to be a more nuanced conversation, and unfortunately, some of the narrative on LinkedIn doesn't sort of fall into that bucket.
I agree.
But and I do think that two-speed solution is probably more than two speeds, but that, what can we solve relatively quickly? What can we solve slowly? And for the things that are slower, how are we creating the space and the support to do that?
Yeah, and that's my question, right? Because change is uncomfortable, and we are asking people to change how they built very successful businesses and careers, how they run those. And so how do we do that? And you mentioned data, and I note on your LinkedIn profile, one of your achievements is using, the Great Place to Work data to make the case and drive change. So how do we inspire the most senior leaders? Look, there is this Indeed study that shows if you get wellbeing right, you'll outperform the market. It's there, that is coming. And for me, I think that will drive this change. But how do we respectfully get those senior leaders on board?
I think we need to not be afraid of framing it in a real business context. It's the thing. I think there's a bit of, you see sometimes people are like, I don't want to hear about that stuff because it's just the right thing to do. But you need to be a bit more cynical about it in a nice way. One of the best bits of feedback I've ever had from someone, actually a real legend in this space, I will name drop her, a lady called Barbara Harvey, who was one of the real pioneers in Accenture on mental health. And she said, you've got the right mix of compassion and pragmatism, which is my favorite bit of feedback ever.
Yeah.
And something I sort of try and still hold myself to on an almost daily basis. It's you've got to respect those people's agendas. If you are the CFO of a company, you've got to engage them as a CFO.
Yeah.
You've got to go to them and say, this is why there's money in doing this. And that's where the link with data comes in. I think also generally probably organizations need to be a bit more comfortable acknowledging external research and using it versus trying to recreate it for themselves, because the stuff that's easier to do in an anonymized external study, especially with the tension between organizations wanting to have insight into the well-being of their people and trying to be respectful of the data privacy of their people and broader external regulations about data privacy. So using external research better, and then aligning, with your audience, looking at things like how is this going to shift the profit margin of the company, and then acknowledging that the great win is that's also going to improve. If you look at things like attraction, you look at things like productivity, you look at how happy people are in a workplace, it all syncs together. But I do think you have to frame it in a business context. And I think you need to not be ashamed to do that and see that as a dirty thing to do. See that as a positive thing to do, acknowledging the context that, most of us are working in.
Yeah, I agree. I think, because the right thing to do camp will be doing it anyway.
Yes, exactly.
So it's the other camp that we're needed to convince. And, again, what we're trying to do at FormScore is create the data set that can help facilitate the how. Once we're going to do this, then okay, what are the drivers that are impacting work at the team and the organization level? So I want to talk about music in the last few minutes and a bit of fun stuff. I asked you to choose a mood boosting track. As you know, music is something that I'm integrating with mental health in terms of my performances, and it's how I stay well when I can't exercise through long COVID. So you gave me a couple. I'd like to play a little bit from Lean on You by the Allergies featuring Dynamite MC. Great track. Why did you choose that one as a mood booster? Why does that one work for you?
I mean, it's upbeat. The lyrics, and it's from a mental health perspective, it's like you can lean on me, I can lean on you, and we'll be just fine. Done. There's some really nice rhyme schemes in there, and I'm married to an English teacher who she's like that's not a real rhyme, and there's lots of things in there that she would not class as a real rhyme, so that amuses me. It's just a really nice sentiment, done really well, upbeat. I don't think you can put it on and not be slightly cheered up. So it's not a particularly deep insight, but that's brilliant.
It for me. Well, let's have a little clip of it now. Here we go.
Yeah, we had to do it again. Allergies, Dynamite MC. Last time we were hot. This time we
you can't help it.
Come on. If I'm all worn out, then I can't turn out. Is that all for me? You better fill my cup. I don't want no trouble. I'm trying to have a good time.
If I'm all worn out, then I can't turn out. Exactly.
Yeah, it's brilliant.
Health and well-being in 2 very short sentences.
Yeah, love it. Great choice. Well, I've added that to the playlist that I'm putting together, and I'll share that at the end of
I'm very flattered.
This series. So thank you so much. So look, we're going to do a quick fire round, something I haven't asked you to prepare for. But if the future of well-being were a colour, what would it be for you, Paul?
Oh, well, I work for Accenture, so that'd be purple. everything's purple.
So you are on brand.
I hope our branding leads are watching this.
Very good.
Yeah, I'm going to stick with purple. Yeah, it's purple.
Yeah, purple. So for the InsideOut Awards, part of our brand at the InsideOut Awards is pink and purple, and so I got people to dress in pink and purple last night. It was just a wonderful show. I think they were all cursing me prior to getting ready. So good choice, purple. Yeah, I love it. If the future of well-being were a animal, what would it be for you?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm just going to say a Labrador, because Labradors make me happy. They've got a sort of like a beautiful innocence about them, but they're also quite sturdy, and they make the world a better place.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, and I think that I've got a dog as well, and they're great for your well-being. They get you out. They unconditional love. It's wonderful to see. Yeah, great choice. If the future of well-being were a place in the world, where would that be?
It would be Grasmere in the Lake District, which is a selfish and personal choice, but it's just a place where I feel safe. So we used to go there a lot when I was a child. We used to live in Lancashire, so I go to the Lake District a lot. And it's quite an easy walk. So we did it from when I was quite young.
Mm.
And I just have these really lovely memories of this nice walk. And you walk, if you park in a certain place, you walk along kind of a brook and a stream that then just suddenly comes out onto the lake.
Yeah.
And you're surrounded by mountains. You feel like you're in the middle of nowhere, even though you're actually quite close to a few towns. And I just, whenever I go back there, I just have this perfect feeling of sort of safety and serenity. And I think if we can give people that feeling of safety, then we're doing all right.
Amazing. I love it. You know, you painted a beautiful picture there for me. Final one, you may have already answered this. If the future of well-being were a food, what would it be?
Some pizza.
Yeah. I'm totally with you. Why pizza for you?
I think pizza is a great example, going back to your point of 80-20, of well-being cannot be puritanical. And it also goes back to the point about being pragmatic, that you've got to acknowledge it's a bumpy road. You've got to acknowledge there'll be days when you will make choices you're not entirely happy with, but they are choices. And you've got to, go off the rails a little bit sometimes so you can get back on the rails again.
Yeah. Love it. Love it. Thank you so much for sharing those. I'm going to put them all together in a nice, fun graphic for you.
Amazing.
So what would be your top tip for professionals in the workplace who are looking to improve workplace well-being?
I think if I could sum up in one word, it would be integration. So well-being is yet another thing in the workplace, and it's a very important thing. Inclusion and diversity is very important. Sustainability is very important. Oh, and the day job is very important. So how do you bring well-being in a way that doesn't just feel like yet another thing? And that's both from a kind of user perspective, a employee perspective, but also in terms of getting things done. So how can you be intersectional with it? How can you introduce well-being into things like International Women's Day, International Men's Day, Pride, etc.? How do you make sure your programs are complementary? So, if you are looking at your people lead training, make sure there's a well-being element in there versus having a separate well-being thing, and then framing well-being in a way that is integrated. So don't just talk about benefits, talk about, if you've got, menopause is a great example. So our menopause support is now framed around, yes, we have PEPI, which is a very good support, but we also have clarity on how you can use our policies to, if you need to take time off, and where our menopause support group is. So it's all in one place, which sounds really simple, but I think because these things, especially in big companies, build over time, things can be very fractured. So always look at that opportunity to integrate. And obviously that applies to your business processes as well. So taking the time at every point to ask, how will this impact the well-being of our people? And going back to that slightly sort of know your audience, what does that mean in terms of the harm that's going to do to our business if we don't think about that at this point?
Yeah. Brilliant. Love it. And there's lots I could say to that, but we're out of time. Last thing, you've mentioned one recommended watch of the Spider-Verse movie, which I'm looking forward to seeing when I can find that out.
Oh, it's brilliant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What else would you recommend in terms of a read or a listen or a watch?
In terms of listen, I'm a really big fan of the Josh Bersin podcast, especially if you're working in the HR space. Josh Bersin podcast. He's very good at hitting like the topics of the moment. They're always like 25 minutes long, really digestible. If you can only listen to one, and again, another shout out to Sheila Piper because she recommended this, the one about falling in love with the problem. And again, going back to my point on integration, just is a perfect listen in terms of how we need to sort of solve these things, solve the problem, not just run initiatives. And I think that also goes back to your point about culture. And then in terms of reads, I've got two actually, which I've got a visual aid. So Joy of Work, which I know isn't a particularly original one, if you're looking at how you kind of improve work. More personally, I'm also a big fan of The Power Hour by Adrian Herbert, which is in terms of how you create that time and space for yourself. And then going back to what we were saying about then communicating those boundaries, it's a great, pretty punchy read on how you can sort of build that space into your life.
Amazing. Paul, what a discussion. We could go on literally all morning, I'm sure, but thank you for giving up your time and your perspectives. It's been wonderful to have you on the show. This is the Future of Wellbeing podcast with me, Rob Stevenson. Paul, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.